All right, we have a very special guest on the show today. He's been on this show before, and now he is officially the Republican nominee for the U.S. Senate in our great state of Ohio. JD Vance, welcome back. How you doing, sir?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, first of all, congratulations on your primary victory.
I
Uh,
appreciate it.
Absolutely. So, talk a little bit about what your priorities would be should you become the next senator from Ohio.
Well, I think we got to fix I mean, I don't even know how to put this, but sometimes I feel like our American economy is more like a third world country than what we've all come to expect from the United States of America. I mean, everything from, moms unable to get baby formula for their kids to, we've got terrible inflation crisis. We've got, grandmothers who are taking care of grandbabies because of the opioid problem. And of course, we know a lot of those illegal drugs are coming across the southern border, imported by the Mexican drug cartels. I just think we got to get back to having a normal functioning country where people can buy the things they need. They can go to jobs that are meaningful and pay a solid wage, and they can take care of their families without feeling like, everything's going to hell. And that's, I think, unfortunately, what a lot of Ohio families feel like is happening right now.
So, talk a little bit about some of the things that we can do to stop everything from going to hell. I guess I don't know any other way to ask that.
Yeah. Well, I think number. So we talk about inflation a lot, right? And it's a big problem. We should talk about it a lot. If you break this down to its core components, one of the main reasons we have an inflation crisis in this country is because we have an energy crisis. So, we see this in the obvious ways. It costs more money to fill up at the pump, but in a lot of non-obvious ways, because the things that we rely on, whether it's computers or cars or toys for our kids, a lot of this stuff requires energy in order to create in the first place. I mean, plastic is created; it's a byproduct of petroleum, right? So when you have an energy crisis, it drives up the cost of everything, both the obvious and the non-obvious stuff. And the real tragedy here is that our energy crisis is really self-inflicted. So there have been a couple things that have happened. First of all, the Biden administration has made it hard to develop new oil and gas leases. It's made it harder to get oil out of the ground. It's made it harder to refine that oil. With the shutdown of the Keystone pipeline, it's made it hard to get that oil or that gas from one place to another. So that's one side of it. And then it also affects a lot of energy workers. Right in southeastern Ohio, we have a huge energy economy. We could have a much bigger energy economy if we were able to explore and develop all those resources. So that drives down the cost of goods for everybody else, but it also employs a lot of good middle-class Ohioans in jobs that can support a family. And I think that is sort of part number one of the inflation crisis. It's not the whole thing, but that is the part that's been the most self-inflicted, that I think is the easiest to deal with from a public policy perspective.
We're talking with JD Vance. He's a Republican nominee for the United States Senate. Your opponent in the general election is Tim Ryan, and he's running a very interesting campaign. It seems like he's being Republican light, if you will.
Yeah.
What do you think the biggest contrast is between you and your opponent?
Well, I think, the most obvious contrast is that, I actually believe the things that I say, and he's running away from a 20-year record, man. I mean, this is crazy to me. I've only been in politics now for about a year. I'd never run for political office before this. And the level of shamelessness to actually have a record for 20 years on defunding the police, on shutting down America's energy resources, on spiking this inflation crisis on the southern border, and then to pretend that you believe 180-degree difference from what you have voted on for 20 years is just a really crazy thing. And I think that, I guess another way of putting this is that, I think I've got a record of job creation. I've worked in the private sector, and he's got a record of harming Ohio families with the decisions that he's made in public office. And that really, to me, is the challenge that we've got here. We've just got to tell the truth, right? Tim Ryan is one thing on the campaign trail and something else entirely when he goes to Washington. And I think if people know the truth about my values and my priorities versus his record, we're going to win this thing in a landslide. And that's the challenge of this race, is to actually get out there and tell the truth to people.
One of the things that we talked about before when you were on the show is kind of the direction that the Republican Party is going in and the direction that it could go in, where it's almost kind of morphing to looking almost like what the Democratic Party used to be, with
Sure.
a working class base and things like that. And we talked about attracting Black working class voters and Hispanic working class voters, adding that to the coalition. I don't know if you've seen a couple of articles recently, one in the American Conservative that basically said that Republicans should not go after working class voters altogether, that they should still make sure they keep elites. There was an article in the National Review also saying that Republicans shouldn't make common cause with unions, for example. What are your thoughts on the direction of the Republican Party today, and kind of that it seems like there's a little bit of internal back and forth as to whether the party should actually go in the direction of being a multicultural, multiracial, working class party or not?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a big debate we're having within the Republican Party. I mean, obviously, I come down on a particular side of it, which is that, we are, for better or for worse, and I think for better, and I understand some people think for worse, we're inheriting big chunks of what, was the FDR coalition 100 years ago, which is, working class people, patriotic people, people who send their kids to fight in our wars, who go to work, who pay their taxes, but who've really been left behind by a lot of the decisions that have been made in Washington, let's be honest, by both parties over the last 30 or 40 years. I think a lot of them are looking for a new home. But, it's not just white working class voters, it's Black working class voters, it's Hispanics and so forth. I think that, one thing we have to be careful with is, as we develop this new coalition, is that we hopefully do a good job serving those voters. We do have to remember that politics is about a lot of different things. And one of the things I think, that article in the American Conservative you mentioned, I think I read that article and I agreed with it, in part because the point that it made that was important to me is that American politics, you still got to have leadership. And so we can't just focus on who the voters of the next generation are going to be. We've also got to focus on who the leaders of the next generation are going to be. And if we're being honest with ourselves, and this is frankly one of the reasons why I think the Republicans should go in a more populist direction, the universities are dead set against conservatives. If you think about that, if you think about the business world, increasingly, the biggest tech companies, the biggest multinational companies are increasingly hostile to conservative values. That's been going on for a little while, but it's just so obvious now for everybody to see. And so we've got to make sure that we're developing a generation of leaders that, when that working class coalition puts in, people like me or whoever else into positions of political power, we can actually do something with it. And another way of saying this is politics is about both the voters, but about the generation of leadership that you cultivate. And a lot of Republicans, this is why you have a Republican Party or a Democrat Party or whatever party is your own, is you're thinking about the future. You're trying to develop that next generation of leadership. And I think Republicans could do a lot better job on that. Even in my Senate campaign, and talking to people who are trying to make sure that a good like the right kinds of people are working in Capitol Hill offices or working in the next Republican administration. I think a lot of people recognize that man, we've got great voters and we got a lot of energy right now, and frankly, we've got a lot of momentum, thanks in part to the mistakes of the Biden administration. But we've actually got to convert all this energy into public policy, and that takes leadership.
We're talking with JD Vance, the Republican nominee for the U.S. Senate in our great state of Ohio. We talked briefly earlier about the economy. I want to dig into that a little bit more, especially for Ohio. As you know, the Midwest economy and the issues that we're dealing with in some ways is kind of unique compared to the rest of the country, especially with, all the impacts of moving manufacturing overseas and things like that. What are some of the things that you think that we can realistically tackle to kind of fix some of the public policy decisions that have been made that have really, hollowed out some of our great cities?
Well, I think we got to realize that, for 30 years, we thought, or at least a lot of people told us, that what was going on in China and going on in Mexico, it was just inevitable, right? That we were going to lose those factories. And the story we were told is that we would lose a lot of these factories. We'd get a lot of cheap consumer goods because, it'd get made cheaper in China and Mexico. But then the American workers who lost their jobs, they'd find something else to do. And that something else would be higher paying. So, right, everybody was going to benefit, right? A rising tide was going to lift all boats. And we know in Ohio that really didn't work out. And that, again, that's true for working class white family in my neck of the woods, or, working class black family in Cleveland, that when those jobs disappeared, a lot of those young men, especially, they never got back into the workforce, right? They were never able to support the families that we all believe that, young people should be able to support. And so the trade didn't work out as it was promised. And I guess my belief on this is we cannot give up on making things in this country, both because we want to make stuff and be self-sufficient and independent if God forbid we get in a war with somebody, but also because we want a lot of those manufacturing jobs to still be supporting middle-class families. There's no example of a country in the world that has a vibrant middle class that doesn't also have a vibrant manufacturing part of their economy. And so, I believe we've got to be willing to put tariffs on the Chinese. Look, if you're going to do business with the Chinese, it's a free country. You can do whatever you want to, or I guess I should say a free world in that case. But if you're a business, we're not going to force you to make things in the United States. But if you're going to make it in China, we're going to penalize you for doing so. If you want to do business with the world's most evil and repressive regime, you've got to pay a consequence. You've got to pay a penalty for doing so. And I think when you do that, we actually start to assert America's interest as an economic sovereign nation.
Yeah, it seems absurd that we are so dependent upon our chief competitor. Is it even possible? Because I've heard some people make the argument that it's too far gone at this point. Is it even possible to decouple ourselves from China to a significant degree where we're not, being dependent upon them for everything?
Yeah, I think criticisms of me always come back to this, and they say, well, JD, of course you're not going to bring back every single manufacturing job. And I always say, look, that's not really the question. It's not whether we bring back every manufacturing job. It's whether we bring back some of those jobs. And more importantly, 100 years ago, we were manufacturing things that were much different than we are today because technology changes and the things that people need change over time. But we need to make sure that, if some crazy new pharmaceutical is invented, that cures cancer in 10 years, then it's being made in the United States so that our people can benefit from it and so that we can actually employ people to make that stuff. Or if there's some new gadget, we got to make sure that stuff's manufactured in the United States. I think that really is the question, is whether we build an economy that continues to make things and ensures, that we employ Ohioans in order to do it. I'm not one of these people, and I don't think really anybody believes that you can bring back every single one of the millions upon millions of jobs that left in this country. But really, that's not the goal. The goal is to make sure that we still have a vibrant middle class and that we make things in this country. And I think that's very attainable, even though there are some things that probably won't ever come back.
Talking with JD Vance, running for the United States Senate. We got a couple of minutes left here. Obviously, one of the big topics right now is that tragedy, that shooting that happened in Texas in Uvalde. And now we're having a conversation about, what policy should be done to address that shooting and school shootings in general. Obviously, there's the debate over gun control versus school safety. What are your views on it, and what do you think the best approach is to address these issues?
Yeah, so I worry a little bit that whenever one of these things happens, we get into this cycle where you hear, a lot of gimmicks from politicians and not a lot of real answers to what's going on. So, one thing I've been asked a lot about, right, is background checks. And I don't know about you, but, I'm a firearm owner and I come from a family of gun owners. And every time I've ever bought a gun, I've had to do a background check. And the guy who purchased the AR-15 and then shot up, 20 kids in Texas, that terrible tragedy, he had passed the background check. So I think we got to be honest with ourselves that a lot of the buzzwords that people throw out there are ultimately not going to solve the problem here at the end of the day. And I tend to think that, we unfortunately, we live in a sad reality where, first of all, terrible mental health crisis in this country. A lot of people who frankly should be committed to mental institutions, who we just let roam the streets. I mean, we see them on the streets of our biggest cities. And unfortunately, we see it when they go and shoot up a bunch of innocent people at the very extreme end. And that's one crisis. We've got to, be willing to put the resources, but also put our foot down and say that when a person is crazy and is a danger to themselves and their community, we don't let them just roam the streets of Cleveland or Washington or wherever else and hope that nothing bad happens. We actually solve that problem and try to get those people some help. And then the second thing I think we got to say is, look, this is evil. And but it is the reality that we live in, that people have decided to prey on schools because they know that they're vulnerable. They know that there's usually not a person who's going to protect that school if somebody goes in there and does something bad, and they know they're going to get a lot of headlines if they want to go and commit a terrible act of violence. And so we've actually got to really bulk up school safety in this country. We've got to make it harder to get into schools in the first place. We've got to make sure there are well-trained people guarding the schools. And people say, they don't like that. They don't want to go to a school where there's, a security guard there that makes sure that nobody shoots up the school. And honestly, I don't like it either. But we're in a world now where schools have become targets. And if we're going to be honest about fixing the problem, we've got to make our schools more secure. As much as we don't like it, that's the world we live in.
Well, and that's kind of, one of the arguments that I've been making as well. I think it's almost like people want to cling to their Pollyannish view of the world and pretend that we live in Mayberry. We don't live in Mayberry. Like, we're going to have to do some things to protect our children. And to me, and I would love to get your thoughts, like the whole gun control conversation, I don't know how much the things that they're proposing would actually be effective to stop these things. I don't see it. I don't see how gun control would be effective there.
I don't either. And I always get into this argument with people, and I say, look, obviously I'm a Second Amendment guy. I'm a firearm owner. But before we even get to the question of whether this infringes on people's rights, let's get to the question of whether it works, right? Because we surely don't want to do something that's totally useless. So let's just start with the fundamental question of, does this work or not? And I think what you find with so much of this stuff is that what they're proposing, again, it sounds good. It frankly, from a politician's perspective, it polls well. It'd be very easy for me to go out there and say, well, we just need expanded background checks. But I think I actually have a responsibility to people to say, you know what, we have to do the things that actually work. And when you have a situation where the school shooter passed a background check, we need to be honest with ourselves that expanding background checks is not going to solve that problem.
Mm-hmm. We're talking with J.D. Vance, the Republican nominee for the United States Senate, and we have just a couple of minutes left. So my last question, one of the things I like about doing this in this way, this type of format, is because I hate soundbite culture. I like to be able to ask the question and give you the full freedom to get your full thought out.
Sure.
That's a novel concept. And so one of the things that has been kind of controversial is your views on Ukraine.
Sure.
And obviously here in Northeast Ohio, there's, we have a large population of Ukrainian Americans and Eastern Europeans in general. So just talk, because I think we've been hearing like bits and like sound bites and not the full context of your view on this issue. So talk a little bit about what is your view on what's going on with the war in Ukraine right now.
Yeah, we could have a whole, half-hour conversation just about this issue, but I appreciate this. So let me try to summarize this briefly in three thoughts, right? So first is, we've got to separate the tragedy of what's going on in Ukraine, the injustice of Vladimir Putin's invasion, from how we respond to it as a rational matter, as a U.S. government. And that's been, step number one is, when we rush into this stuff emotionally, we say, look, there's a tragedy over there. We've got to do something about it. The experience of this country the last 30 years is that we screw a lot of things up and we make a lot of mistakes. and we kill a lot of our own people, right? That has been the experience of America and foreign policy the last 3 decades. So let's step back a little bit and be rational about this, right? That's sort of my first argument. My second argument is that however tragic we find the situation in Ukraine at a personal level, it is not a primary concern of the U.S. government. What I mean is, if you think of all the issues that are going on, inflation, the opioid problem, the crime problem, the drug problem, the immigration problem, and all the problems on top of it, and then you've got this Ukraine issue. My basic view is that we should care much more about those issues, and we should focus more on those issues than we should focus on the Ukraine question. And I think it's kind of weird. I saw somebody told me that there was a point early on the Ukraine crisis where the media was spending 20 minutes on Ukraine for every 1 minute that it spent on inflation, and 30 minutes on Ukraine for every 1 minute that it spent on the U.S. southern border. Like that is a major, major failure of focus. We got to solve the problems closer to home, and that's been something I've tried to hit pretty hard. And then the third point that I'd make is we got to be careful that we don't escalate this situation into something that kills a lot more Ukrainians, potentially a lot of Americans, and a lot of Europeans as well. Because the thing that I really worry about is, look, Vladimir Putin, it's a powerful country. It's not nearly as powerful as it used to be. Ukraine is a relatively smaller country, and they've got good weapons in part because we've been providing them with good weapons. But at the end of the day, what is ultimately going to happen here is that Russia and Ukraine are going to have to figure out some solution that works for the both of them. The idea that, we're going to go in there and fix this problem, or somehow, I've heard people say we should send American jets to patrol a no-fly zone, which would get us involved in a war with Russia. I don't think America is going to get involved in this crisis. I don't think we should get involved in this crisis. And so at the end of the day, what we should be doing is, the Israeli government's been saying this too, that we should be trying to de-escalate this situation and get the Russians and Ukrainians to negotiate, to stop fighting, to stop killing each other. That I think is the most useful thing that we can do, because at the end of the day, this war is going to go on for a very long time unless these guys decide to put down the weapons and stop fighting. And I don't think anything short of U.S. involvement in the war, which would be a catastrophe, is going to stop that.
All right. Let everybody know how to follow you on social media if they want to get more information about the campaign website, all that good stuff.
Yeah, so jdvance.com. We need all the volunteers and all the resources we can get. Tim Ryan is going to have a ton of money in this race, and we're trying to do everything that we can to make sure we get our message out there. They can follow me on social media. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, Truth, Getter, all the social media networks. So please follow us, follow along, and certainly in November, come out and vote for us.
Thank you so much, sir. I know you have a packed, busy schedule, and I really appreciate you making sure that you spend some time with us. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Hope to see you in person soon. Take care.
Yes, sir. You too.